Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I am here with Michael Lofton of Reason and Theology to talk about dealing with controversies in the church. Michael, it's so good to see you again. I think the last time I was on your show, I did that 4 hour lecture on icon veneration.
Yeah, that was pretty epic.
Yeah, dude, it was so great being in your studio, seeing your
Thanks.
family, just doing all of that. It was awesome.
Thank you. How's school going?
Oh, it's going well. So I'm starting. Oh, yeah. So I'm going back to Cambridge. Let's see here on Saturday,
Mhm.
flying out, and then school starts on Monday. And I'm doing 5 classes this semester, so it's going to be a lot.
Yeah, 5 classes. That's rough. That's a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah. Although
Golly.
I'm excited because these are like
Mhm.
5 classes that I actually want to do. So I
Sure.
don't know if I told you these classes yet, but basically, just really quick, ancient
Mhm.
Jewish wisdom literature
Mhm.
beyond the canon, so ancient Jewish texts outside of the Hebrew Bible. And
Mhm.
then I'm doing, let's see here, elementary Greek, Messianism and ancient Judaism, and then the Protestant Reformations. Those are the 5 classes I'm doing.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Cool. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, that is exciting. It's a lot easier when it's something you enjoy. Yeah.
right. And I was
I
also
hear you.
joking that like studying the Reformation is like studying an X. So
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
speaking of speaking of past things that we've left behind,
Yeah.
uh Michael, today we're talking about dealing with controversies in the church. And so I think my audience knows you pretty well, so we'll just get right into it. So Michael, I know that there was a time in your life when you were much more of a kind of traditionalist or kind of
Mhm.
rigorist, if I can put it that way. What
Mhm.
changed in your life and where are you now?
Yeah. Well, when I came into the Catholic Church, I started noticing a lot of these controversies, and it was pretty easy to fall into some of the indoctrination on social media. And I really bought into a lot of the propaganda, specifically about Pope Francis. I came in under Benedict, but at
Mm,
the very tail end. So pretty soon, Benedict resigned, and Pope Francis was elected. And really early on, within weeks, there were already just a whole flurry of social media posts and reports about him that were very negative and very critical. And then a certain narrative was kind of established about him, and that kind of produced a very negative view in my mind of the magisterium. So I started buying into a lot of this stuff, and I'm happy to talk about maybe what some of those specifics are, but that's kind of how I fell into it. Then, as far as how I came out of it, it wasn't overnight. It was
mhm.
a long series of issues, and also with my detour in Eastern Orthodoxy,
Right.
having to work through that. And the thing that, of course, brought me back was the papal magisterium. So then having to square, okay, I'm intellectually convinced of the papal magisterium on paper, but how does that work out in reality, right?
Mm,
Especially in light of Pope Francis, and just had to grapple with that question for a while. And not just him, but also concerns with the pontificate of John Paul II. Um, John the 23rd, among others, the Second Vatican Council. I had to work through some of those issues. But I'll tell you a pivotal moment for me that really just stands out vividly in my mind, though it was all a process. It wasn't just the overnight thing. There was something that was very pivotal. And that is, I was talking about the issue with the Vatican Gardens ceremony. And I did a video pointing out the inconvenient fact, contrary to the narrative,
mm,
that the ceremony itself calls the image not Pachamama, but Our Lady of the Amazon. And that's a neglected piece of information that pretty much the vast majority of people who criticize the ceremony have neglected and not really accounted for. And I pointed that out. And I just simply asked people to, we need to question the narrative here that we've been given on the matter. Now I've gone to do a lot more extensive research on it, but at that point I was just pointing that one thing out. The ceremony calls it Our Lady of the Amazon. How do we square that with the claim that the Pope worshipped an idol in the Vatican gardens?
mhm.
That was pretty much the effect of the stream, though I reiterated over and over and over and over and over demon worship is wrong. Idolatry is wrong. The idols of the nations, the gods of the nations are demons.
mm,
It's repudiated in scripture. That's a bad thing. So if there is idol worship going on, I condemn it. I was very emphatic about that. Well, not long after that stream, a very prominent content creator, um, did a post about me saying that he's so disappointed in me because I now defend demon worship.
mm,
And I thought, huh, that's weird. Given the fact that I explicitly condemned demon worship just now, and I also gave some really important evidence demonstrating that this wasn't even an idol, it was Our Lady of the Amazon. Now, whether you agree with that or not, you still have to grapple with that evidence.
mm,
And it would be unfair to say that I'm defending demon worship in light of what I've demonstrated in that stream. And so I thought, this is weird. I've had this guy on my show before. And he was going off on the Vatican in relation to the question of the third secret of Fatima, saying it's still hidden. The Vatican is suppressing the truth of what the third secret is because the third secret actually condemns it and the Second Vatican Council. And so it's hiding those things from the faithful. The one that has been released, that's not the real thing or it's not the full thing. I had him on the show and he was promoting that thesis. And I thought, this is odd. If this person can get me so wrong when I'm explicitly
mm,
rejecting demon worship, I now have to question his research and reliability in other areas. And I started paying attention to a lot of these critics of the papacy. And I started asking the question, are they doing to Pope Francis what this guy just did to me?
mm,
And sure enough, in many cases, they were. And then I had to ask a more fundamental question because I tend to be introspective and I don't want to criticize somebody else when I have the same fault.
mm,
I had to then ask the question, have I done the same thing to Pope Francis that this guy did to me?
mm,
And the answer was, yeah, in some cases, unfortunately, I have.
mm.
And that's a problem. And that needs to be corrected. So I had to, work through a lot of the objections that I had to things in Pope Francis's pontificate. I had to kind of retrace my steps and go back through those issues. But that was really a pivotal point for me when that happened.
Yeah, and bringing it back then to just where you were before when you were talking about how you distrusted the magisterium.
Hmm.
You were talking about how this was near the end of the pontificate of Pope Benedict.
Hmm.
Could you talk about just, yeah, some of those beliefs that you had, or what
Hmm.
was going through your mind that caused you to kind of fall into those, maybe, I don't want to say conspiracy theories, but maybe
Hmm.
ideas that you had? Mm,
Hmm. One of the first things that happened under Pope Francis's pontificate was the controversy over his words, "Who am I to judge?"
mm,
And it was often portrayed as him somehow downplaying, same-sex acts or something like that, um, or clergy who engage in these activities. Whereas that's of course not actually what he was saying contextually, but the way it was portrayed in social media kind of gave you a different impression. Now, when you're exposed to, I don't know, several thousand of those instances
mm,
throughout a period of, let's say, maybe 5 or 6 years or so, every day you're being conditioned through social media to believe this controversy about Pope Francis, this spin about Pope Francis, this negative thing about what Pope Francis said, and you're not really fact checking them in the same way that you might fact check an atheist who claims that the Bible said this or that or contradicts itself, or the way a Muslim might critique scripture. You might go the extra mile in giving scripture the benefit of the doubt, but
right.
you might not really do that with Pope Francis. You might just kind of go with, well, everybody's saying it on social media. It must be true. There must be something to it. And again, when you have just years and years and years and every single day of that kind of conditioning, it builds a certain perspective about Pope Francis. And so whenever you hear that, oh, Pope Francis is going to change the church's teaching on marriage, or he's going to change the church's teaching on communion for those who are in a state of mortal sin, you're kind of conditioned to anticipate and interpret everything he says through that lens. And so when a more Setizia dropped, rather than critically evaluating it. I mean, I certainly read it, but I
Hmm.
read it with this lens of suspicion.
Right.
Because again, there had been years of kind of build up to this point of Pope Francis is, going to give way. And when you read the document with that kind of lens of suspicion, you can conclude the worst things possible. I likewise note, I mean, if you use that kind of lens of suspicion with the Bible, you can, come to the conclusion that the Bible's not inspired or
Mm.
inerrant. So it's not a fair approach to interpreting a text, but it was nonetheless the one I was conditioned to use whenever analyzing a Morsa Titsia. For me, that was a big thing. It was like, wait, the Pope here is now compromising on the church's teaching, especially on the question for people who are in a state of mortal sin. I was getting the impression that somebody who's in mortal sin is now being allowed to receive Holy Communion. And it's like, well, if that's true, what's the purpose of the claims of the Catholic magisterium? What's the purpose of the papacy? If it can't guard something so basic, am I wasting my time? Have the Eastern Orthodox been right all along? And so, having to then consider questions like Eastern Orthodoxy, I started to look into it at that point, but nonetheless, those were a couple things that stand out in my mind through
Mm.
those years.
And this kind of bleeds into the second question anyway, but if
Mhm.
I can just expand on it a little bit,
Sure.
you were pointing out that there's like this, rather than a hermeneutic of continuity, there's a hermeneutic of suspicion in
Mhm.
interpreting all of the things that are said about the Pope or that the Pope allegedly said.
Mhm.
And so, can you kind of maybe describe for us what is? I mean, and I don't. I'm not asking you to psychoanalyze, but just try to help us understand what might be going through somebody's mind. Just to do our duty of charity, right? How might they be seeing things right now? Explain things from their perspective, perhaps.
I think the way people are seeing things is that Pope Francis is trying to subvert the traditions of the church. That's one of the narratives with, for instance, Traditionis Custodes.
Mm,
So if you're constantly conditioned to believe that Pope Francis is trying to suppress anything that is traditional, and again, there's a lot of propaganda out there saying just that. He's trying to suppress the traditional liturgical tradition, the traditions of the apostles, the constant teachings of the church. He wants to suppress those things. Um, once you've bought into that somehow now the papal magisterium has become an agent of Satan and an agent of destruction, and you might mix it in with some false prophecies and um maybe even misunderstandings of Our Lady of Lourdes, or I'm sorry, Our Lady of La Salette. um Rome will become the seat of the Antichrist, which was not part of the authentic message and is on the index of forbidden books, but most people don't know that. And so they just kind of go along with it. And when you are just fed all of that propaganda, you can finally believe, or you finally come to the point that, well, okay, Pope Francis is an agent of destruction and he's trying to subvert the church. And you then interpret every piece of news that comes out and every word that comes out of his mouth
mm,
through that lens. So I think to kind of sympathize with where people are, if you've been given nothing but 10 years of daily conditioning to believe this,
mm,
I could totally see how you could be pretty given over to the notion that Pope Francis is trying to destroy the church. And for someone to come along and question that narrative, you're going to think you're delusional. Where have you been the last 10 years? You haven't been seeing all the same stuff that we've been seeing for 10 years. I can
mhm,
understand why somebody would have that impression. But the problem is that they've bought into, again, 10 years of conditioning, 10 years of propaganda.
mm,
I think of, for instance, there might be some people on the more progressive end of things that have probably been conditioned to think certain things about people who are more traditional or conservative.
yeah. Mhm,
They've just been conditioned to think these are the worst people in the world. They hate you, right? They won't make distinctions like there's a difference between hating the sin versus hating the sinner. No, 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 no. They hate you. They want to destroy you. They're evil. And, when you just have years of that conditioning, I could totally understand how a progressive would think of conservatives or traditional Christians as like the worst thing ever
Right.
because you've just been given years and years and years of propaganda about the opposition.
Hmm.
It's likewise the exact same way within the church. And so my point is, we need to retrace our steps
Mm.
because though there are some legitimate criticisms to Pope Francis and this papacy, the vast majority of the criticisms are unfair. And
Right.
so the ones that are legitimate, it's hard to even get to a conversation where we can discuss those because it's all being overshadowed by other criticisms that are not legitimate that need to be corrected.
Mm. If I can just say some things too, I mean, what you pointed out about like just the years and years of conditioning through
Mhm,
propaganda. I mean, everybody knows about how we're living in a time of fake news and sensationalism. And
mhm,
the idea that somehow the same thing isn't happening in the church and affecting the
mhm,
church, I think is ridiculous. A lot of us just take things for granted. We assume that we can trust the sources that have been given to us. When in reality, I think the more scary proposition is that we need to really investigate who we're listening to.
mhm,
There are people who, see a content influencer and they think like, oh, I can really trust this person. And this person seems very devout, very sincere. And then they realize, actually, wait a minute, I can't trust this person. But it's like they're in too deep, maybe, or they trusted this person too much. And it's kind of scary to think, oh, I have to question this person now and try to get my source, of information through a different means. The other thing I want to say too,
mhm,
Michael, just real quick, is that
mhm,
um, I think a lot of Catholics, at least maybe who are very critical of Pope Francis,
mhm,
I think they felt a lot of embarrassment towards the media reception of Pope Francis or some of the things he said, because I'm sure like this has happened to Catholics, right? Like they're with their Protestant, I don't know, brothers and sisters, and they say, "Oh, you hear about what Pope Francis said the other day?" And then they just have to deal with like constantly being embarrassed like that. And then
mhm,
they have to kind of feel, I don't know, maybe some people feel icky doing this, but they
mhm,
have to like explain, well, no, that's not really what the
mhm,
Pope meant. And then they just get tired of it. They're just
mhm,
done trying to be a Pope
mhm,
splainer, right?
mhm.
I think those are just two thoughts that I have, but you were about to say something. So,
That's spot on. I mean,
yeah.
for a while, a lot of these voices that are now critical of Pope Francis, they did try to defend Pope Francis at first, but I think that you're right. They eventually kind of gave way, and that's unfortunate because they've then become the very thing that they were originally trying to oppose, and that is a dissenter
Mm.
and a propagandist. Um, so yeah, that is certainly unfortunate.
Yeah. And I'll just say this really quick because I usually don't talk about my position on Pope Francis on YouTube and in public because I know that that's just going to be like a crazy hotbed issue. But my basic position, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Michael. I view Pope Francis as I would my own human father, right? Like I respect him, I love him, I recognize his authority. I recognize that he's given to me by God, and if you're ever going to raise an accusation against like the pope or against your own father, you had better come with evidence. You had better come with like the strongest and most serious caution. um and so I even think about your analogy of scripture and just kind of what I've been studying in my own master's studies right now, where I remember the professor was talking about how in my New Testament class there are these alleged contradictions between the gospels, and he said, yeah, I mean, you can harmonize these if you want.
Hmm.
And it made me think about, oh, yeah. So, if you want to harmonize them, if you have a motivation, you can harmonize these things. But if you don't, if you lose that motivation, you can make it all look like a contradiction. And I just thought about with myself and then with what you were saying, like, because I view the Pope as my father and I love him and I believe that
Hmm.
God has given him to me, right? Like, of course, I'm
Hmm.
going to have this motivation to view him in the best light. And even
Yeah.
if I'm embarrassed, I mean, he's my father.
Hmm.
I love him. And so I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a good approach. I mean, I I would have to say, okay, I hold to inerrancy, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I can certainly say harmonizing apparent contradictions in scripture is much more difficult than trying to harmonize something with Pope Francis and something
Mm,
else the magisterium has said. It's a cakewalk.
mm,
When you have to really start digging deep into the scriptures and harmonizing certain things, and maybe even explaining things like the Trinity,
Yeah. Mhm. Mhm.
especially whenever you're engaging perhaps a skilled atheist or Muslim. Um, Explaining and harmonizing those things is going to be much more difficult than anything you would ever have to Pope Slane with Pope Francis. So it's kind of like, for me, I'm wondering, hmm, if we're having this kind of difficulty, understanding Pope Francis and what he teaches, maybe harmonizing that with something prior to Pope Francis and the magisterium. I just wonder, what do we do with the deposit of faith itself? It seems like we're
Mm.
ripe for the picking at that point. It
Yeah.
seems like any, educated Muslim or somebody could come along and snipe us and, pick us off,
Mm.
if we think that this is difficult. And so, but yeah, I agree with you. Look, we have to give people the benefit of the doubt. And at the end of the day, I still think even with giving Pope Francis the benefit of the doubt, there's some instances where I think that his pontificate is deserving of some constructive criticism.
Right.
Um, that's a far cry, however, from public dissent.
Mm.
Like those are not the same thing. Also, it's not the same as publicly slandering him or bearing false witness.
Right. Speaking of which, what is the position that Catholics are supposed to have towards non-definitive magisterial teachings?
Yeah. Well, if you look at, I think of Lumen Gentium 25 specifically, it talks about religious submission of intellect and will, specifically to the papal magisterium. It also applies to the College of Bishops whenever it teaches non-definitively. So it's the same thing.
Mm.
Um, so religious submission of intellect and will means that you willfully conform your intellect to the proposition that's being taught to you. You don't just merely pass over it in silence. You embrace it intellectually. So you adopt that position, even if you're not entirely convinced of the rationale behind it.
Mm.
Why? Because the one who is teaching teaches with authority and with the voice of Jesus Christ, even when it teaches non-definitively. That's straight from Pope Pius XII in Humani Generis. Um, so due to the fact that the teacher teaches with this authority, this authentic or authoritative magisterium, we buy into the proposition, even if it's not something that I would have personally arrived at intellectually. That's the kind of submission that the church calls for.
Hmm.
There are some rare exceptions to that. The church can say, in rare cases, a well-trained theologian who has really wrestled through the issues, in some very, very rare cases, may withhold assent of intellect and will to a non-definitive teaching of the church.
Hmm.
Um, but withholding assent, and this is a private withholding of assent, withholding assent privately is not the same as publicly promoting dissent. And
Right.
this is
Mm.
where people get confused. They'll also think again that criticism is the same as dissent, and it's not the same thing. Um, so we often forget our obligation. Number one is religious submission of intellect and will. Very rarely would a person be able to dispense with that, and even if they do, it's a private act. It is not something that is public. It's not something you get on social media and you now start to publicly dissent against the magisterium. Again, the same document that speaks about how we can withhold that assent in rare cases, Donum Veritatis, is the same document that has paragraph after paragraph after paragraph condemning public dissent
Mm.
and locating the roots of public dissent in liberalism,
Mm.
modernism. That's the irony here, because a lot of the people who publicly dissent against the magisterium today are the very critics of modernism, and yet they are doing modernism themselves when they
Mm.
publicly dissent. And they're also following in the footsteps of the German bishops who dissented against Humane Vitae. That's really where this notion of public dissent comes from, and it's something that the church has
Mm.
condemned. I mean, I'm happy to talk about that more, but hopefully that'll get
Yeah.
us started. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so for somebody, let's say, who has this private dissent, what are they
Mhm.
supposed to do with it? Do they just stay quiet, or are there
Mhm.
channels by which they can express their concerns to the magisterium?
Yeah, what it notes is that they are to express those concerns with their pastors.
I see.
So they are to communicate that with perhaps their priest or their bishop. And then it notes, look, at that point, it's up to the shepherds of the church to handle the situation. And if they don't provide the kind of clarity, if the magisterium doesn't clarify itself at the time, you may have to suffer in silence, it says,
Hmm.
knowing that the truth will ultimately prevail. You don't go on social media and start to put pressure on the magisterium. It explicitly forbids that. And that's exactly what the dissenters of Humane Vitae did.
Hmm.
They attempted to pressure the magisterium, the papal magisterium, into taking a different position. Um, yeah, so I I would note that, and then other people might mention Canon 212. I did a whole show is exhaustively showing Canon 212 doesn't allow for public dissent. But what Canon 212 would allow for is going to be a public expression of concerns.
Sure.
So constructive criticism, that can be public. I mean, prudentially. I mean, you want to be wise with it, but you could express public criticisms in a prudent way, um, per Canon 212. But that's not the same as public dissent, which is I'm rejecting this teaching, not merely criticizing something constructively.
Yeah. I mean, that just all the stuff that you're saying just makes sense to me because if we're going to be living in this church community and this is the one church that Christ established,
Mhm,
then we have to well, sometimes I mean, I'm going to say it and people are going to hate it, but we have to
mhm.
sometimes be willing to be sheep and let the shepherds be shepherds. And I think sometimes we kind of I guess here I go, but but like I think in our democratic society, we're so used to like expressing our outrage at like politicians and dragging them through the mud. And then we think we can do the same thing with our bishops and with our priests and turn it all into a democracy. And I think there's
I'll-
something dangerous there.
Certainly.
Yeah.
It's also a Protestant ecclesiology at its core
Yeah. Hmm.
because it says, I sit in judgment of the magisterium. That's Protestantism.
Mm.
Now, we might not look like Protestants because we haven't yet embraced sola scriptura or just thrown out the liturgy altogether or something, but we still embrace at the core an ecclesiology that is Protestant. When this says, rather than the magisterium binding my conscience and I submit to it, I'm
Hmm.
going to now sit in judgment of the magisterium and tell it when it is authentically interpreting tradition. I'm
Yeah.
going to become the authentic interpreter. That's again Protestantism at its core.
Mm.
Um, and when we do that, Pius X notes that that's gravely sinful. In fact, he explicitly notes that public dissent is grave sin. So this isn't a small issue. This is a massive scandal and is incredibly sinful for us to be engaging in on social media.
Mm.
But it's given a pass today because it's seen as authentic. It's seen as traditional to even sit in judgment
Right.
of the magisterium, and it's anything but.
Mm. I mean, and I'll just say one last thing before we move to the next question, but it kind of reminds me of when I was growing up. My parents they come from an Asian culture, a much more traditional background,
Mhm,
and their whole idea is that you respect who is in charge, no matter who it is. Even if you disagree, you try to like very carefully proceed with your criticisms. And I
mhm,
remember for me growing up, this was during the time when I was a progressive, during when I was about in high school. I was like, what? That's stupid. And I would like go out and protest and be all angry and things like
mhm,
that. And then I realized that, like, actually, it's funny because when I finally began embracing more of my Asian culture, that made me more Catholic and made me
mm,
realize that, like, oh, actually, in a lot of cultures, they recognize the importance of social cohesion, the importance of unity, and how, you don't just maintain the unity by assenting to only when, I don't know, like the definitive rulings, but you also assent in the little things too to maintain that unity, or else you can unravel the whole thing. Like I
mhm,
think in my culture, you go with the father. And if the father like, makes a decision that you disagree with, but you're under his roof and you're still his child, then you go with it, right? So there are things like that where I'm like, okay, it's kind of funny because this is very much like Catholicism being, let's say, part of a more ancient culture, a more ancient worldview that I think makes
Hmm.
me feel more at home with going back to the apostles rather than
Hmm.
what we have today, which, as you pointed out, is much more Protestant and liberal and modernist.
That sounds awesome from a cultural perspective. I wish maybe some of us could adopt that. Some of us
Yeah.
Americans, right? You know, I look at what you're or I hear what you're saying, and you're pointing to docility and humility, and
Hmm.
that's again the disposition that we should have for the magisterium, being teachable.
Yeah.
Rather,
Hmm.
however, we think that we are now the teacher and we sit in judgment of the teacher, and it's such an odd thing. There's no docility or humility there when we do that.
Mm. And I wonder too if there's just, any faith that Christ is actually keeping things together,
Hmm.
or if we actually do need to dissent this badly because
Hmm.
how do I put it? Yeah, well, maybe you can jump in, Michael. But yeah, I mean, for me, like
Hmm.
I have utter faith that Christ will keep things together, but I think that there are some Catholics who kind of hold with bated breath, like,
Hmm.
oh, what if tomorrow,
Hmm.
like I don't know, there's a contradiction in the magisterium ex
Hmm.
cathedra, or I don't know.
Hmm.
I feel like some are just waiting for like when do I have to give this up, or something like that. They're
I
waiting for a
think
falsification event.
hmm. I think that what a lot of people have embraced, if not a falsification event in definitive teachings, at the very least is the notion that indefectibility is merely limited to definitive teachings,
Mm,
and anything short of that can be the most destructive and harmful thing. So that the magisterium, when it teaches non definitively, can become an agent of chaos, destruction, and of Satan. So it can teach heresy, it can implement disciplinary decisions that if you obey them, it will be soul destroying. And they think, well, hey, look, indefectibility is still preserved because, got a few ex-cathedra teachings that are free from error. So yeah.
mm,
And I don't know if they've really thought through that very well, but I don't know how anybody could take that seriously. But that's the underlying assumption behind much of this dissent is I have to dissent because the Pope is teaching contrary to sacred tradition. And if I embrace his teaching, it will be soul destroying. So I have to go with the higher authority, God, who teaches this. And again, neglecting that it's the magisterium that's the authentic interpreter of tradition and the
mm,
deposit of faith, not me. That again, that's that Protestantism issue. And then thinking, well, and the magisterium is messing it up so bad that if we don't dissent, we're going to be led to hell. So again,
mm,
the assumption there is that the magisterium, when it doesn't teach definitively, can now be an agent that destroys souls. And again, not just maybe the people, like a pope living scandalously with a mistress or something like that. Obviously, that could be soul destroying as far as scandal.
mm.
And that's not what they're talking. They're talking about his teachings, the magisterium, not just personal behavior. I think that's what's being assumed in many cases.
Mm. Well, Michael, I think one of the things that you're going to be remembered for in terms of your like theological research and contributions is your kind of development of this idea of the charism of safety. And so before we get into what exactly a charism of safety is, I want to first talk about your journey to getting to this point because we've touched
Hmm.
on that a little bit, but I think in
Hmm.
particular the charism of safety. How did you come across that idea, and what made you want to go further into it?
Um, I had noticed that I had personally embraced the contrary thesis.
Mm,
And if I was going to take Catholicism seriously, I had to overcome that. Especially coming back from Eastern Orthodoxy to Catholicism. Um, for a while I did buy into this proposition that like, look, the church is hiding the third secret from us because the third secret shows us that, Vatican II is a false council and that the corruption and teachings begins at the top. i.e., the Pope. And so again, bought into a lot of propaganda that the church has become an agent of destruction, at the very least, whenever it teaches non definitively. And amor laetitia would come to mind, right?
Mm.
Um, so I had to start working through that. And, reading some of the manualists, I realized, they held to a different view. They held to a view of a charism of safety. Also, coming across John Paul II teaching about this charism was challenging. In addition to reading some things in Donum Veritatis and Humani Generis and other magisterial documents that was showing me a different thesis. And I have a passion and love for the magisterium. I was already on a road to discover as much as I can through studies of the magisterium. And as I'm doing this, I'm coming across this material that really fights against that thesis that I had adopted. And some things in Pastor Eternus as well,
Mm.
noticing the language that it uses there, it doesn't seem to limit indefectibility merely to not, or, I'm sorry, to definitive teachings alone. And so, having to work through a lot of those magisterial documents and other secondary sources through theologians, I started to recognize that I think I made an error. I think what I did is I thought, look, unless it's definitive, it could be the worst thing ever. So I had to realize, there needs to be some nuance here. But I also clearly recognize that, all right, well, there is a notion such as a non-definitive teaching, and non-definitive teachings can't be inerrant. Otherwise, if non-definitive teachings are inerrant teachings and guaranteed to be inerrant teachings, they're just taught non-definitively, that destroys the whole purpose for determining what is definitive versus non-definitive,
Mm.
what is papal infallibility versus what is not. It becomes useless. Why even have criteria for papal infallibility if everything ultimately taught by the magisterium, as long as it's authentic magisterium, is inerrant? It just
Mm.
becomes useless. So I realized, look, I recognize inerrancy or free from error is going to be limited to definitive teachings. But I obviously can't go to this other extreme for many reasons, specifically or especially because the magisterium guards against that. So there has to be a middle position here where there's this category of non-definitive teachings where the proposition of the teaching could be an error. In other words, they're not guaranteed to be inerrant or free
Hmm.
from error.
Right.
They could propositionally be in error, but the level of error will never be so grave that it is of the grade of heresy and is soul destroying. It would be a much lower grade of error. In studying the theological notes and theological censors, I realized there's degrees to teachings. There's also degrees to error.
Mm.
And there are some errors that are not soul destroying, um, whereas there are some that are, such as heresy. So I realize it looks like there's this middle position of the church that, yes, inerrancy, that's restricted to definitive teachings. But just because it's not definitive doesn't necessarily mean it can all of a sudden be heretical. There's a middle position here where yes, the proposition could potentially be an error, but it has some safety to it. There is some charism and assistance of the Holy Spirit who doesn't guarantee that the proposition is true,
Hmm.
but the Holy Spirit guarantees that the proposition that is offered wouldn't be so wrong, wouldn't be so erroneous that if the faithful embraced it with religious submission of intellect and will, that they would be led to the lake of fire.
Right.
And I certainly think that if the church teaches non-definitively heresy and binds the consciences of the faithful to embrace heresy, I think that is soul destroying for the people who buy into that.
Mm.
Um, And so again, here's this notion of, well, can the church become this agent of destruction that can bind you to something that is soul destroying? It seems, according to the magisterium, no, there's this middle position that would say no.
Mhm. Some people might question, though, and maybe this you can get into more detail now on the charism of safety, but they would question. I mean, is there really such a thing as a safe error?
Hmm.
They might be
Hmm.
worried about that, and so maybe can you talk about what is this idea specifically of the charism of safety and what is it
Hmm.
not?
Yeah. So in the theological notes, we kind of grade um, the level of certitude of certain teachings, and therefore we also grade the um, um, contrast of those teachings or the denial of those teachings, theological censors. And we realize that there's grades here. It's not like every error is created equal. So now we have to ask, okay, well, not every error, for instance, is of the grade of heresy. Some could be on the other opposite extreme of the spectrum and could be something that's merely offensive to pious ears. Even in those cases, like the proposition could be true, but it could sound bad,
Mm,
or it could be offensive to pious ears. We would say that there could be a theological censor there, even though the proposition is true. So again, in the theological censors, there's really a pretty wide range from heresy at the very top all the way to the bottom, where you have some theological censors that could even be true but just sound bad. Now, I want to give maybe an example of perhaps an error that wouldn't necessarily be soul destroying. And if somebody doesn't like my example, okay, fine. They can come up with another one, but they have to recognize that there are these categories in the theological notes, and just go to some of the lower grade theological notes and come up with an example of that if you don't like mine. But here's one that I've thought of. Let's say the authentic magisterium non-definitively proposes that Moses is the author of the Pentateuch.
mhm,
Okay. I don't think anybody's soul is in jeopardy if they embrace that view, right?
mhm,
I don't know how a person's soul would be destroyed by assenting to the view that Moses is the author of the Pentateuch. But let's just say hypothetically, the church comes back on that proposition and reverses it, and then definitively teaches the opposite, that Moses is not the author of the Pentateuch. Just hypothetically, right?
mhm,
And it's doing so definitively, and we've already granted that it's going to be protected from error in those instances. For the sake of the analogy, though, this previous hypothetical error, and again, I stress hypothetical, that Moses is the author of the Pentateuch. Um, I don't know anybody who would say, yeah, somebody in that kind of interim period, their soul would have been destroyed if they had embraced that
mm,
hypothetical error. No, they wouldn't have been. Maybe the proposition was not true. Maybe it turned out to be not true, but I don't think it was destructive. But that would be different than the church teaching in its own authentic magisterium prior to Nicaea 1 that Jesus is not consubstantial with the Father.
mm.
That does seem to be soul destroying. Or has the church ever definitively, in a solemn definition, taught Jesus is the Messiah? No. Let's say the church came around, I don't know, in the year 200 and taught in its mere authentic magisterium Jesus is not the Messiah. I think that would be soul destroying.
Mhm.
And some might say, well, everything's fine because it was just taught non-definitively. Yeah, but everybody who embraced that proposition at the time and was bound to believe that,
Mm,
I really think that they would have been led astray in a really important issue here. So obviously there has to be degrees of error, and some errors are not as immediately destructive as others.
mm,
Some could be destructive, but maybe not as immediately as, say, the proposition that Jesus isn't the Messiah. So if you want to somehow argue that the proposition that Moses, is the author of the Pentateuch, somehow you think that that's destructive to souls, I don't know how you would arrive at that, but certainly you couldn't argue that it's immediately a threat to a person's soul. So I don't think that we can just say all air is created equal, all airs are unsafe. That's just doesn't seem to be factually true. That's one example. I'll give you another one. What if the magisterium taught in its authentic magisterium, non-definitively, that Judas did not receive Holy Communion on the night Jesus was betrayed?
Hmm.
Would anybody's soul be destroyed by embracing that proposition? No. There's a lot of people that believe that right now, and I certainly wouldn't say that their soul is in jeopardy. But what if the church came back later on, reversed that, and taught definitively Judas did receive Holy Communion on the night in which Jesus was betrayed? Again, I wouldn't say, well, the people who had believed the error back then, I guess they're, going to hell or something.
Hmm.
No, it's again. So I think that we can recognize that there are air grades to air here. Maybe another one last example could be the monastic tonsure. I think in the Catechism of the Council of Trent, though one might not argue that this is put forward as authentic magisterium, I understand that. But for anybody who did teach it, um, I believe the Catechism of the Council of Trent puts forward the view that the monastic tonsure is apostolic, and it, turns out that's not the case.
Hmm.
Um, but would any soul be destroyed by believing that the monastic tonsure is apostolic? No, there's nothing about that proposition that's soul destroying.
Hmm.
So even if the churches, if some in the church who express that were wrong and the church says otherwise, it doesn't really do anything. I don't know. I hope I haven't belabored the point too much, but I think that I've made it pretty clear that not all errors are the same.
No, I think it's worth like going into that much detail for people who are trying to absorb and think through this idea. Um, I guess I have a few thoughts here, and then
Hmm.
eventually, well, I'll try to wrap it up. But
Hmm.
it sounds like to me, Michael, what you're saying is with the charism of safety is that look, um, you're talking about like how bad could an error be from the church's non-definitive magisterium? Like, let's say this is the lower bound, right? This is how low you can go.
Hmm.
It's never going to get so low to the point where if you actually obeyed and complied, your soul would be in hell, right? That you would actually, or even maybe not just hell, but that you're actually like damaging your soul on the
Hmm.
way to hell.
Hmm.
Um, so just different degrees there, but also
Hmm.
that you would never have to actually arrive at the point where you had to say things like the Pope is the Antichrist, the
Hmm.
magisterium has been infiltrated so badly that we can't trust it anymore until we get a
Yeah.
new Pope and a whole new college of bishops and stuff like
Hmm.
that. Um, like, I'm sorry to just keep belaboring the point, but I think maybe a helpful analogy here is that some people will say, some people will say, like, with their idea. I mean, maybe we've been guilty of this in our Catholic
Hmm.
apologetics because we talk about how, oh yeah, it's okay, infallibility just pertains to definitive, permanent teachings
Hmm.
of the magisterium. And then if you imagine like the Pope, like a pilot, and the plane always just comes ever so close to crashing, but then the pilot pulls it all back together, but then he might be doing flips and turns and wings and engines might be falling off, but he's still going to get us on the landing pad, okay? you know you're like, well, I don't know if I want to enter that plane.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I
you're
don't know if I
saying
want to
no,
go
it's not
there.
going to be like that, right? We might have some turbulence, but it's not going to
Yeah,
be like
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's no. Yeah, we can't speak of like magisterial perfection. There
sure,
certainly are deficiencies in the magisterium. Even when it teaches definitively, there's deficiencies potentially there in the way it's expressed. Not to the point that it's erroneous, but it could always be expressed better.
sure,
Pope John Paul II acknowledged that. So even definitive propositions might not be free from all deficiencies. They're not deficient in the proposition, but maybe again the manner in which they're expressed. So that if that's true of definitive propositions, and it is true of them, then it's certainly true of non-definitive propositions. So there could be some areas to critique, but it wouldn't be that scenario that you just outlined there, or
right,
another one that really caught my attention before. And that was, okay, well, if we're just limiting this protection of the Holy Spirit merely to being free from error in definitive teachings alone, and that's it, um, does that then mean that, let's say, the magisterium or the Pope, for instance, could teach in his magisterium every single day, as long as it's non-definitive, he could teach every
Mm,
single day a new heresy and in a new encyclical, release like a new encyclical every single day with a new heresy in it. And none of these are ex cathedra. So right, we're not touching on papal infallibility.
hmm.
But every one of the propositions every single day for 2000 years now is heretical. If we're leading all of the faithful into heresy every single day. And that's okay because hey, definitive teachings, papal infallibility, that's still intact, right? So that's still okay. We still have an indefectible church, right?
Mm,
I don't think anybody would take that seriously. And they shouldn't. If you're limiting indefectibility simply to we've preserved all seven sacraments, and these papal teachings here or these conciliar teachings here and these very limited cases are free from error.
yeah.
But everything else can be incredibly destructive. I don't think anybody's going to take that seriously.
Mm,
That view of indefectibility just does not cut it. There has to be some element of indefectibility even outside of those
right.
parameters. And in fact,
Mm,
according to the magisterium, there is. And so,
mm,
um, but yeah, that should get you thinking. Like if you reject the charism of safety, okay, well, what's to prevent that from happening?
hmm. Yeah, it makes me think about just we shouldn't make the idea of divine protection over the magisterium so thin and narrow to just those like seven sacraments and then the definitive teachings of the councils and the popes. Yeah, because then that makes it too thin to the
Hmm.
point where it's too wobbly and it can't sustain the unity of the church in the first place
Hmm.
and the trust and the confidence of the people. It makes
Yeah.
me think about, for example, when St. Paul talks about how, he says, "This is my opinion," right? And he says, I would prefer for all of you to be like me, unmarried. But if you're
Hmm.
burning with lust, then go ahead and get married.
Hmm.
Now, the thing is, like, people don't marry. I mean, maybe some I don't do, but I know that a lot of men that I know who got married to their wives, they didn't get married because they were burning with lust.
Hmm.
They had genuine love and
Sure.
attraction towards this woman, and it moved them to get married. And so somebody might say, I disagree with Paul a little bit here on how he described the conditions for being able to get married, right? It's
Hmm.
not just burning with lust, it's actually being motivated by love and a vocation, a calling from God
Hmm.
to get married.
Hmm.
And so there it's like, I see what they're saying where they might disagree with Paul a little bit because Paul's giving his opinion. But also, like, I do acknowledge on the other side that Paul is giving something still under divine inspiration, but it's an opinion.
Hmm.
And I should
Hmm.
take that seriously as well. But it's
Hmm.
never to the point where, like, I don't know, Paul just got human nature so wrong that if I followed it, then, you know,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think it's a harmful error. That's what I'm trying to say with Paul talking about marriage there and celibacy.
You would say it could be expressed better even if the proposition is true.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, and and that's an interesting analogy too, since we're involving the element of inspiration too. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good analogy.
mhm,
Um, but I would never extend the charism of the divine protection of the Holy Spirit to the other extreme of like ultramontanism, um, that would effectively assert that everything the Pope teaches is infallible and free from error. Like,
sure.
no, that's another problem. And yeah, that's wrong. Some teachings are potentially erroneous, um, but that doesn't mean it's devoid of all protection. And
Sure.
that's where people make a mistake. They think, well, if it's not protected from error, it
It's
has no
just wrong.
protection at
Yeah,
all.
right.
It's like, you missed something there. You missed something. You missed that other charism, not of protection from error, infallibility, but a charism of safety or divine assistance, as John Paul II puts it. Yeah.
Hmm. Michael, my last question for you is just what difference do you think it makes if there is a charism of safety or not?
Well, I've heard people say, well, are you saying that basically Catholicism is all of a sudden falsified if you deny this? Hmm. I would say that okay, maybe you can redefine indefectibility in a ton of magisterial documents in such a way that you could still make an argument for the Catholic Church, even by denying the charism of safety. But I think it's to the point that you have to redefine things that nobody can take you seriously.
Hmm.
Because again, it's like You have to redefine indefectibility to such a limited condition to where maybe it checks out on paper, but nobody's going to ever take you seriously. And
Right.
so
Mm.
it's like, does it automatically falsify Catholicism if you reject it? No,
Hmm.
but I certainly think that it does for any reasonable person.
Hmm.
You would have to say, look, this is pretty much a falsification event. Um, so yeah, that's kind of my nuanced answer there. Now maybe somebody can come up with a better way to understand indefectibility and all these magisterial documents that doesn't leave us in such a compromised position, even if they reject this charism of safety view. And I'm willing to hear it, but I've never heard that. And I've also haven't heard people grapple with the fact that the authentic magisterium does teach this thing. They seem to think that this is just a theological opinion.
Right.
It's like, no, this isn't a theological opinion. This is taught by the magisterium. So we have to grapple with what the magisterium has said on this charism.
Hmm. And let me just say one last thing really quick too. Sorry, I'm very interested in this topic ever since I
Hmm.
started seeing, you bring it up and other people who have
Hmm.
engaged with it. But at least from my reading of the New Testament, and
Hmm.
just other things that I've looked into and investigated, I think that there has to be something like a charism of safety. Now, and obviously because I accept the magisterium's teaching on this too, like that also plays into my assent to this idea. I think it would be interesting though to just see this idea further developed and squared with instances of like Peter failing in the New Testament or making
Hmm.
mistakes, and just how all of that goes together.
Oh yeah, I mean
Yeah.
Peter can certainly act as a hypocrite and deny our
Hmm.
Lord. That those are private acts
Mm.
of the teachers of the magisterium. So like a pope could in his private person be a heretic.
Mm.
That's not the same as teaching heresy in his magisterium.
Hmm. Hmm.
So the pope could privately be a hypocrite. That's not the same as teaching heresy. So I will grant a pope can fail to a great degree as a personal person, yeah, as a personal individual and theologian,
Hmm.
but yeah, not in his teachings.
Mm.
But I have a question for you,
Yeah, go ahead.
and I'm curious to get your thoughts
Hmm.
because this is your area. When Matthew 16 discusses binding and loosing,
Right.
would you limit Matthew 16:18 through 19 and its binding and loosings to merely ex cathedra papal teachings?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, at least for St. Peter, I would say no.
Hmm.
And the reason why I say that, I mean, because there are some questions here about to what extent, the binding and loosing gets transferred to the successors. Is it in
Hmm.
exactly the same way, or are there some nuances? Because obviously, you and I both know that the apostles, if they individually bound and loosed
Hmm.
with like the full force and independent, force of their own power and apostolic authority, that would be almost like an ex cathedra ruling on their own.
Hmm.
So there are some distinctions, right, between the authority of the apostles and what's passed on to the bishops. That's not controversial. But anyway,
Hmm.
going back to Peter, when Jesus says, "Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven,"
Hmm.
that seems to me to not limit it
Hmm.
to just like some specific narrow set of conditions.
Would that
Uh,
pass to Peter's successors?
oh yes, because that would be necessary for governing the entire church and
So
keeping it
here,
united. Yeah,
So here's my question.
yeah.
All right. So if, let's say, this concept of binding and loosing found in Matthew 16:18 through 19 applies to, let's say, non-definitive acts of the papal magisterium, such as non-definitive teachings or
Hmm.
perhaps prudential judgments and disciplines,
Right.
universal disciplines. It notes that, whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of ratified in heaven. My
Hmm.
my my question then is like, okay, if the Pope could teach heresy when he binds and looses, how's that ratified in heaven?
Yeah. Hmm.
I don't know. It's something worth teasing out, though. Right?
Hmm.
It's certainly not an area of my expertise
Hmm.
when it comes to Matthew 16:18 through 19, but it's worth thinking about.
And I'll say too that a lot of scholars agree that like Acts chapter 5, when Peter rebukes Ananias and Sapphira, which is clearly a disciplinary act, is an
Hmm.
instance of him binding and loosing on
Hmm.
earth and having it be already bound in heaven. Because then once he issues the judgment, or it's really like he says that the Holy Spirit has already condemned you.
Mhm.
So he gives the judgment that God has already given. And so that
Mhm.
would be an instance of him binding and loosing, even though it's not what we would consider to be analogous to an ex cathedra decree. It's just
Mhm.
disciplinary. Well, just disciplinary. You know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Mhm.
Um, for me, what I'm interested in is, I guess, dealing with like something like Galatians 2 with what happens in Antioch
Mhm.
and just putting that all together and finding out like how this doesn't, how you square Matthew 16:19 with Galatians 2 and what
Mhm.
happened in Antioch. I think that's actually something that I've been trying to think about in my head.
So in that case, he was acting as a hypocrite. He wasn't teaching heresy, right?
So I've looked into that issue, and yes, he was acting as a hypocrite. That is Paul's accusation. I
Mhm.
think the well, okay, yeah. So yeah, this is good actually, because what happened was Peter was acting as a hypocrite and people followed his actions,
Mhm.
and in following those actions
Mhm.
they began segregating Jews and Gentiles.
Mhm.
So I guess it was, strictly speaking, his hypocritical action
Mhm.
that gave the impression, it wasn't teaching necessarily, but it was an impression that led
Mhm.
other people to follow his lead, his
Yeah.
personal example. Yeah,
So think of a pope today, a pope who is caught, in some terrible sexual act or something.
sure.
Wouldn't that scandalize people? Wouldn't that be destroying to some souls due
Yeah,
to
that's yeah.
scandal?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But that's certainly not the magisterium, the papal magisterium. That is the
I
pope
see.
who
Mm-hmm.
exercises the magisterium, but he's not exercising the magisterium in this moment of sin. So the one who exercises the papal magisterium can scandalize people and lead people to destruction.
Mm-hmm.
However, his authentic magisterial acts
Mm-hmm.
cannot.
Right.
Um, yeah, there's no debate there.
Sure.
Popes can do scandalous things. But I think that that's what people are confusing.
I
They
see.
always
I
point me
see.
to popes who slept with this and that person, and I'm thinking, what does that have to do with papal teachings? Nothing. In the
Mm.
charism of safety, we're discussing specifically magisterial acts, not personal defects and behaviors. That's likewise the same distinction that is being maintained in the case of Honorius, which I'm happy to discuss in detail, but that's the one that's being assumed. The Council
Right.
Fathers are not condemning him for teaching heresy, but rather for acts that where they basically he in his private person they were saying he embraced heresy.
I see what you're saying.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so popes could embrace heresy in their private person and stuff like that as a private
Right.
theologian. That's not There's no charism protecting that.
I see what you're saying. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a helpful clarification then, because I mean, what you just said about Peter and Galatians, that's what I would always say when somebody tried to say, here's an instance of Peter, teaching ex cathedra an error. And it's like, well, no, that's clearly not what's going on. But
It's not a teaching at all, even
right,
non-definitively.
right. And so what the charism of safety thesis isn't that the Pope won't be scandalous in his personal life. It's just that in his teaching capacity,
Hmm.
that which you need to assent to with at least
Hmm.
intellect and will is not going to be soul destroying,
Hmm.
or I mean, would you want to say, but it might be scandalous in how it's worded,
Hmm.
perhaps, but
Hmm.
it's not going to be like soul destroying to the point where you need to start rejecting the magisterium and be your own pope.
It could be deficient in the way it's
Sure.
worded. That could always be done better. That even again applies to definitive teachings. The charism would also extend to prudential judgments and universal disciplines. And
Mm,
so it's like, the Pope can't mandate some kind of liturgy that, if you celebrate that liturgy, it's destructive to your soul or something like that.
right. Mm.
Yeah. I would just
Well,
add that too. Yeah.
well, Michael, I look forward to seeing more of your work in this area, and thank you for
Sure.
coming onto my channel again. I appreciate it.
I'm glad to do it. Thank you.
Oh, Michael, before we end the episode, can we talk about your Answering Eastern Orthodoxy book?
Sure.
Just give us a
Yeah,
quick
absolutely.
plug for it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So what the work does is I go over a lot of the objections that Eastern Orthodox have for Catholicism, specifically like papacy issues, filioque, immaculate conception, purgatory, stuff like that, doctrinal, historical, and liturgical objections. I go over the most common ones, the top 30 that you'll hear from Eastern Orthodox apologists.
Mhm.
And I show not only how they're wrong, it's just not an accurate criticism, but in most of those cases, the thing they're criticizing is actually found in their own tradition.
Mhm.
So if they're criticizing papal infallibility, the criticism fails. And by the way, here's where your own councils teach papal infallibility. So you're being inconsistent by even bringing this up. And so that's what I do in the work. And it's written for especially Catholics who are thinking about leaving for Eastern Orthodoxy. However, Eastern Orthodox who pick up the book or even Protestants, they would benefit from it as well. But it's specifically for Catholics who are thinking, well, maybe the grass is greener over here. Well, okay, hold on. Consider this. Because the very thing that you're leaving is actually found over here in the Eastern tradition. So, is it really right to leave Catholicism in light of that?
All right, Michael. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks.